what's up guys? Today I have a video that I feel somewhat forced to make because I've noticed a lot of misinformation floating around regarding the rerun characters and the new ones as well that I want to talk about in this video. Specifically, I'm going to be focusing on clearing up some misconceptions around Xiao and give you guys an honest look at his power level, his strengths, and his weaknesses, and why there are so many misconceptions about this character. While most of this is because of the current Abyss, the Rift Hounds are Xiao's worst matchup by far, making him a lot worse than the other Abyss rotations, and he's also a character who you have to build a team around and play to his strengths and around his weaknesses if you want to get the most value out of him. Now, I am someone who's played this character for hundreds of hours, so I've basically mastered playing around his weaknesses, but as with basically every video or every serious video on my channel, I'm going to be coming at this through the perspective of I want you guys to save your primo gems and only spend them if you need them, not waste them on a character who could feel underwhelming or not up to your expectations, to where I'm going to be brutally honest in this video with my thoughts on the character from a meta perspective, not from a fun or design perspective, as you already know that I really find him fun, as fun is subjective, and if you like a character and have the primo gems, you should obviously get them to, just enjoy the game. Also, while I mentioned Xiao a lot so far, I'm also going to be talking about Shenhe and the little that we know about her so far and my thoughts on it. With that being said, I want to keep this intro pretty short. Those are the general guidelines for this video. I hope I made them clear. And with that being said, let's get into it. All right, so the first thing I want to do is clear up misconceptions about Xiao and talk about his overall power level as a character. Now, I'm going to be covering strengths and weaknesses, but first, let me talk about the information floating around right now. A lot of people have recently been calling Xiao underwhelming, and the main reason for this is the current Abyss. The current Abyss rotation is the worst one for Xiao by far because the enemies are so annoying for him. That makes him a worse character for the current floor 12 than the previous rotations without making him a bad character. The reason for this is because Xiao's biggest strength by far, in my opinion, is his insane ability to do consolidated AoE to everything around him. What I mean by that is while his damage is good just in general, it's mainly good because it can hit literally everything around him without fail. The problem with that is against enemies like the Rift Hounds, and that's basically the only enemy. I'll talk about some others later, but enemies like the Rift Hound that get staggered very easily without being able to get grouped with things like Venti or Kazuha can be a nightmare for many characters, Xiao included, who can struggle to hit all of them at the same time. In fact, the only enemies that have these properties, at least that I can think of, are definitely the Rift Hounds, those are the main ones, and also a little bit the Geo Vishaps, but those you can play around quite easily by pushing them into each other or against a wall. On top of that, another reason why Rift Hounds are so hard for Xiao in particular is because he's an Anemo DPS, which has its strengths and weaknesses that I'll cover later in the video, but for Rift Hounds specifically, since the resistances are so high to literally every element except with the one that they're weak to, you really want to reduce the resistance of whatever element you're using. However, the ways to reduce Anemo resistance are quite limited, so it is much harder to do. Because of that, these high resistant enemies can be annoying because you can't use something like the 4-piece Verdescent Veneer set that you would use for most elemental carries, or even if you're running like a Geo team, for example, you have access to the Geo Resonance that decreases the resistance just inherently. And just to emphasize once again, the first half of the Abyss will have 2 Rift Hounds that Xiao's usually going to knock away since they're enemies that are very easily staggerable without being groupable. So enemies that are easy to stagger but hard to group, like Rift Hounds, are very annoying for Xiao. Whereas on the second half, which is much more favorable, so again, I don't think anyone should ever run Xiao in the first half, while you are really efficient at defeating the 3 Magukenkis and the 2 Ruin Guards of 12-3, fighting the 1 Rift Hound with the little baby ones around him isn't amazing for Xiao either, since, there's still the inherent problems with Rift Hounds where, yes, on one hand, you will defeat the little ones passively while focusing the big one, so that AoE is very nice, but by the time the small ones are dead, the big one will still have like 50% or so HP, and then it'll end up just being single target DPS, which is not ideal. I do feel that it's only fair though to point out that Xiao is exceptional for the 3 Magukenkis, as you can very easily plunge all 3 and deal massive amounts of damage as you're seeing, which is why, once again, putting Xiao in the first half is usually a bad decision and can make him feel worse, although in general my point still stands that this Abyss is not the best for Xiao. A good example to illustrate this change in Abyss making a character weaker is when you look at Raiden when she first came out. Raiden has always been a good character. When she first came out, a lot of people, myself included, saw potential in the character. However, it was hard to illustrate it because of what the old floor 12 was. If you'll remember, there was a low tide and a high tide mechanic giving energy, an insane amount of energy actually, to your characters that are on field during the high tide. Because of that, showing off Raiden giving you a bunch of energy through her burst wasn't really possible and seemed kind of irrelevant for that Abyss. That doesn't change the fact though that as soon as that Abyss rotated out, Raiden became meta basically immediately as a strong character. Another example would be someone like Venti, who in general just has insane scalings. His burst does massive amounts of damage and can group up enemies, having a niche where he is just the best unit in the game when his burst works. However, overall, a lot of people right now are starting to feel like Venti's a bit underwhelming because of the current endgame content having these giant giant enemies that Venti can't group up, or the addition of new enemies like Spectres who are small but for some reason Venti still can't group. Because of the change in endgame content, characters therefore get a lot better or a lot worse. Other examples include freeze teams if you can freeze or not freeze enemies, single target DPSs or DPSs with more single target focus like Xiao that get a lot better or a lot worse depending on what you're fighting, which is why I believe meta, I guess, is temporary and the evaluation of a character's strengths does depend on what you're doing. With that being said, let's talk a bit more about Xiao in general. In fact, while this Abyss is incredibly weak for him, his clear times still aren't that bad if you put him in the second half and have a good team with him. And so just to sum it up for that first part, and I'm gonna get into a lot more strengths and weaknesses, don't worry, but just the main reason why right now he feels different than usual is because of the current Abyss rotation, which definitely makes him worse, while still not being a bad option. I want to emphasize that, with the Xiao Double Geo team being the most popular team for the second half according to the public data, as this is a very, very strong team at high investment. And so with that being said, let's talk about Xiao's strengths. Now, other than just having really good AoE damage, and that being like his biggest selling point, being able to hit everything around you, so regardless of how many enemies you're fighting, Xiao offering consistent AoE DPS, especially against enemies you can group, Xiao's plunges will hit in a huge AoE around him. On top of that, Xiao is a hyper carry, meaning you can focus all of your investment into him and then run a honestly very low investment team and still get away with it. While some supports want investment, like if you pair him with Albedo or Fischl, in general, a lot of his other supports can be very low investment, like when you think of someone like Sucrose or Bennett, who honestly don't really need the best investment to perform very well. His teams are very flexible, honestly. While yes, he wants an Anemo battery, so that is, I guess, the biggest dependence, another Anemo unit, that's not really a bad thing. Like, why would you not want to run someone like Sucrose or Venti or Kazuha in your team, especially when Sucrose can run the very powerful Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers that will buff your Xiao greatly. Giving attack percent to this character who has very high damage percent from his burst is insane, and that's why it's a joke amongst Xiao mains that Thrilling Tales is just one of the best supports for this character. On top of that, people say that he's dependent on Zhongli, which yes, Zhongli is great for Xiao and present in some of Xiao's best teams, being a Geo unit for the Double Geo team and especially having a shield that shreds the Anemo resistance of opponents. And while that is good, like it is good, I want to emphasize that, and I use Xiao with Zhongli quite often, it is not needed by any means. Xiao can make very free-to-play friendly teams, and while you don't need a shield, if you are dying inside of your burst because you're just not dodging or taking a bunch of damage, and a shield can be nice, you can run someone like Diona, who does work well with Xiao because she gives a ton of particles through her skill and a Favonius Warbow that you can run on her. Now, a character that Xiao can want is Bennett, but he is not by any means dependent on him, and while I personally like using Bennett with Xiao, if my other team needs Bennett more, a character like Shangling, who's dependent on Bennett's pyro particles and his burst, I can very easily make another Xiao team that doesn't need Bennett. A good example is one of the meta teams that, yes, is running 5-star characters, so it's not accessible to everyone, but one of Xiao's best teams literally is just running Xiao, Jean, Zhongli, Albedo, and there are also many 4-star teams you can make. For example, pairing Xiao with Sucrose, Fischl, and then a healer. Yes, Bennett is the best option because he's a broken unit, but if you can't run Bennett, don't worry. You can run other attack buffers because that's mainly what Xiao wants by running, again, Thrilling Tales, Tenacity of the Millith, Noblesse Oblige, and so on. I guess that one was kind of a strength and a weakness mixed together, but other strengths include, first of all, being very easy to get a good crit ratio on, since he has crit rate as an ascension stat, and basically any weapon you're going to run on Xiao, with I guess the exception of Fav if you do that, is going to be crit. Either Homa, Jade Spear, Deathmatch, or even Blacklift Pole being the free-to-play option if you have Star Glitter, all giving you a ton of crit, making the baseline for Xiao quite good. While yes, you still want good artifacts because he is a hyper carry, his artifact sets are quite flexible given the new Reminiscence set, because you can run either 2-piece Glad, 2-piece Reminiscence, or 2-piece Virescent, picking the two best ones that you have, all of which being very similar in power level. Additionally, I wanted to point out that Xiao is someone who is not constellation dependent at all. In fact, while his C1 is nice to have an extra charge, a bit more particles, it's really not as big or not nearly as big of a DPS increase as many other C1s on 5-star characters like Hutao or Eula, to where C0 Xiao is really good and does not need any constellations. But while he doesn't need constellations, like his 6-1 is insanely broken as a C6, making him one of the strongest like consistent DPS. So that is a strength if you are a whale and want to spend on him, although as I said, it's not necessary. I also want to address a few common things that I hear floating around. First of all, regarding the people saying that Xiao needs a new artifact set, while yes, as a Xiao player, I would love for Xiao to get another set, the current sets that he has are actually better than they seem. The reason for that is because 2-piece Gladiator and 2-piece Reminiscence, with Virescent being good as well, but giving these 18% attack sets to Xiao is a lot better than on other characters because of the way his burst and diminishing returns work. In fact, since his burst gives him at level 10 95% damage, he gains so much damage percent that he wants attack more than he wants damage, meaning that running attack sets is actually quite good and hard to beat. In fact, the attack sets presets that we have can even be better than something like 4-piece Thunder Soother, even if you can maintain the electro uptime on opponents, which is why I don't recommend this set for Xiao, despite it giving 35% damage. And while yes, as I said, like a new set would be nice, having 3 2-pieces you can go for and focusing on substats makes him a lot easier to build, but yes, can hinder his damage potential when you compare it with like the 4-piece Blizzard. That's just absurd. But obviously this is factored in when we talk about Xiao's damage, which is something people can forget. When we talk about his good AoE DPS, when we compare him to other characters, obviously it factors in the fact that he doesn't have a busted artifact set like freeze teams do. But obviously this is something that could change very easily in the future. If MiHoYo decides to buff him for some reason, they could do it quite easily. Also, I want to add this isn't really a misconception anymore, but it was in the past. Xiao doesn't really need much energy recharge at all, as long as you run him in a good team comp. And if you're not doing that, then you're just hindering your damage by an insane amount. But pairing him with an Anemo support allows you to run him on around 120 to 125 energy recharge, which really isn't much. And personally, I'm running even less than that, and I have never needed more energy recharge. Also, something kind of funny I wanted to address is regarding Xiao being dependent on his burst. While it is true that you don't want to deal damage with Xiao outside of his burst, like you're not going to be doing physical auto attacks, he's not a character who really has much downtime. When you look at someone like Eula, who is a good character, her burst has a 20-second cooldown, whereas the Lightfall Sword only lasts for around 7 seconds. Because of that, during the downtime of her burst, you're going to be using someone like Raiden, Beto, whatever, like other characters, giving energy back to Eula and weaving in some auto attacks on her. However, with someone like Xiao, when you look at the duration versus the cooldown, you can see there's only a 3-second downtime. Because of that, while yes, he is dependent on his burst to deal damage, that doesn't matter if you have enough energy recharge, except for like overworld content for just exploration. For the Abyss and hard content, as long as you play Xiao properly, and this can be the hardest part that you actually have to learn, you will not really have downtime with Xiao. That's why when you watch some other showcases and you see them not in their burst on Xiao for a long time, you might think that the character is kind of underwhelming. But in reality, what you're supposed to do is use your elemental skill before your burst, then use your burst, so you start with some energy ready, and then you can spend that very short downtime after your burst, swapping between all your supports, using their abilities, something you'd want to do anyways, where you're not really DPSing outside of Xiao's burst. And so while yes, he is a character who's burst dependent, this basically boils down to understanding how to play him and having a team that can give him particles, so another Anemo battery, so that you can spam your burst on cooldown with no real problem. On top of that, he can basically take down any shield. Elemental shields from Abyss mages and other enemies can easily be taken down with Xiao just by spamming Anemo plunges. Now with that being said, I don't want to just talk about the good of this character. I do want to highlight weaknesses because he does have some, and I don't want people to think he's like broken or anything, because everyone has Shangling for free, who especially at C4 is just absolutely busted. And I'm not someone who really considers DPSs as must-pull characters because there's so many good ones that you can choose from. And so other weaknesses that I didn't kind of debunk that are actual weaknesses are the following. His single target damage is not as strong as some other characters like Hu Tao, so if you're looking for a single target carry, I would not recommend Xiao. I do want to say though that a mechanic that I guess is a bit lesser known is that you can actually bonk enemies, get 2 damage per plunge for single target or against just large enemies in general. As you can see by the footage I'm playing, every plunge I'm doing is doing 2 hits, as I am landing on the opponent's head, doing a plunge very close to them to maximize single target damage. For his other weaknesses, he is Anemo, and Anemo isn't the best offensive element. It's a more supportive element, is harder to shred the resistance of because you can't use a 4-piece Verdescent support. And while there are ways to get around that, like Zhongli's shield, or more whale options like Venti or Jean's constellations, it is still a downside that I wanted to mention, as fighting enemies with high Anemo resistance, which aren't too common, but like Rift Hounds for example, can be very annoying for Xiao, especially because it's difficult to reduce Anemo resistance given your limited options. Also, while this isn't the biggest downside, as I mentioned earlier, Xiao is someone who needs a Anemo battery. He really wants to be paired with another Anemo unit. While I don't think he's dependent on characters like Bennett or Zhongli, although they are good supports for him obviously, an Anemo support for Xiao is basically a must, so it can be a bit restrictive in your team building, especially if you don't have too many Anemo supports. Another important weakness to know is regarding Xiao's weapon selection. This can be really easy for some players if you have a good weapon for him, but he does lack in good free-to-play options. What I mean by that is his blacksmith options like Crescent Pike and stuff are not that great for him, and the main free-to-play option, the only really good one, does cost Star Glitter through the Blackcliff Pole. And so having to invest Star Glitter in a character as a free-to-play can be quite annoying, but it is something that is highly recommended for Xiao. On top of that, his gacha 4-stars are not amazing unless you have the Lithic Spear. The only other decent gacha option is the Favonius Lance, especially with Refinement. I do however want to say that if you buy the Battle Pass though, Deathmatch is a great option for him, and then on top of that, as a hyper carry, he does also gain a lot of damage from a 5-star weapon, something like Staff of Homa or Primordial Jadewing Spear, both being absolutely insane for this character. And so while this weapon selection isn't a problem if you buy the battle pass or have a 5-star, that isn't the case for everyone, and Xiao is someone who definitely lacks on free-to-play options. Also, a small weakness, but one I wanted to mention, is that while Xiao isn't constellation dependent by any means, if you are someone who likes pulling for a few constellations, Xiao is not the best character for that, since again, when you look at like Hu Tao C1 or even Raiden's C2, they give huge DPS increases, whereas Xiao C1 is just a bit nice, and then his C2, 3, and 4 are quite terrible, and his C5 is also not great, with his C6 being like the only powerhouse constellation. Another downside is that his burst does not snapshot, so you can lose out on certain buffs that you can give your Xiao before his burst starts. Thrilling Tales, for example, will last for 10 seconds out of the 15 seconds of your burst. Bennett's burst lasts for 12 seconds, although you can kind of extend it depending on how it ticks to make it not the biggest issue. But just in general, buffs expiring during your burst can be annoying, and also the fact that his burst makes you want to stay on field with him for a long time means that if you don't set up correctly, if you don't dodge, if you will need to heal or whatever, you will have to swap out of it, which is really not fun, so you definitely have to plan and make sure your rotation is optimal. Another weakness that I mentioned while talking about Rift Hound specifically, but is the fact that your plunges knock back enemies, and while for some enemies it's much more of a problem than others, you have to basically know how to play around this, because sometimes just spamming plunges can knock enemies far away to where you're gonna have to group them beforehand or push them against the wall, push them into each other, and it can be a downside that you have to play around. I know a lot of people are going to see a video talking about Xiao from a Xiao main and automatically think, okay, well, this is biased, he likes the character, obviously he's gonna advertise the character. Now, once again, I tried to come in this video by not only talking and consulting other theory crafters, but I do try to approach all of these strengths and weaknesses from a meta perspective, talking about when he's the strongest, when he's the weakest, and what you can do to solve every issue. I'm gonna put on screen now, I guess, a summary of Xiao's strengths and weaknesses. This is what I think, and I mean, let me know what you guys think. And I covered each of them in the video, why I think there are certain strengths, why I think he has certain weaknesses, and how to play around them. And so to summarize, while Xiao isn't a character that you should feel forced to pull on because he's not the absolute best DPS, he is still, in my opinion, a top DPS overall. It just depends on what the enemies are. He's one of the most consistent against a lot of enemies, although right now I do want to be cautious as I don't know what the next abyss or next few abysses will have, either greatly favoring a character like this or hurting him if it's just, again, one big enemy, single target, bosses, stuff like that. With that being said though, I don't want to repeat myself anymore, so now let's talk about Shenhe. And for this section, something I want to say is that basically what I'm playing on screen is all the footage we have from the official live stream. We just know what her abilities are going to do and, you know, her design and stuff like that. Now, the one thing I want to say is that for a character like this, I highly recommend you wait till a couple days after she's released for me to make a guide on her and talk to you about my power level, my thoughts, and I will obviously test her live on Twitch as well. Link in the description if you want to catch that. With that being said though, she does seem to be a cryo support that will fit obviously cryo teams, give you energy, but we don't really know her scaling, so we don't know how strong she's going to be or how much energy she can funnel as a cryo support. The one thing I want to say though is that I guess you can basically get ready to pull for her if you want to use cryo teams that need another battery, but it does also depend on who you have. The reason for this is because if we look at cryo characters, there are quite a lot of supports. Characters like Rosaria, Kaya, Chongyun, and Diona, these characters, especially like the other three like Rosaria, Kaya, and Diona, generate a lot of cryo particles already and have a lot of utility to where you may not need another cryo support for your cryo team if that is in fact what Shenhe's role is, which, you know, as of right now is what I highly suspect it will be. Because of that, I mainly recommend Shenhe for players who want to play a cryo team if they either need another cryo support or want to upgrade, as she's a 5-star who will probably be pretty good for that team, or if you are running 2 cryo teams, 2 freeze teams like Ayaka and Ganyu. I do want to specify that freeze teams in general are some of the best in the game. They're absolutely insane, especially in something like the current Abyss where you can freeze the Rift Hounds. And so a cryo support can be a nice addition, but we do have to wait to see exactly how strong the character is when she is out. But yeah, overall, that's all I wanted to say in this video. I hope I did a good job. I know my ideas were a bit all over the place, but I really wanted to show Xiao's strengths and Xiao's weaknesses so that you guys can make an educated decision. I included a summary earlier, so I'm not going to repeat myself. If you want to know what I think, you can rewind and look at that. Good AoE DPS with some bad matchups. We're gonna have to see what the future lies for him in terms of the Abyss. With that being said, I hope I made my points clear. If there's anything I want to add, it will be in a pinned comment, so as always, be sure to check that. If you're new, feel free to like because this video took a very long time to make. Feel free to sub if you want to catch videos as they come live. And with that being said, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.